everybody. Welcome to Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. My name is Brandon Adams. Happy to have the entire Dog Nation team on hand this evening. Jeff Sintel, Mike Griffith, Connor Riley. Over the course of the evening, we will get into the Georgia-Alabama discussion. Everybody, welcome to Cover 4 Live, presented by Saturday, and we'll continue to make sense of the absence of Nick Saban in this game, or at least the presumed absence of Nick Saban in this game after testing positive for the coronavirus on Wednesday. There is a lot to unpack with all of that. Arguably one of the biggest pieces of news thus far this season in college football, certainly some both tangible and symbolic value with all of this. Let's try to address the tangible value as we get things going here on Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. Georgia was around a 6-point underdog in Tuscaloosa when news of the Saban coronavirus came up, and immediately that line dropped in most houses to around 4 points. It's kind of hovered back now around 4.5 points. So a little bit less than a field goal's worth of difference for the belief that Nick Saban will not coach on Saturday. So, Jeff, I guess I'll start with you on this. Nick Saban not coaching on Saturday, is that worth more or less than a field goal to Alabama's final point total on Saturday? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's interesting because I know people, when we're couched to remember these things, we think about, okay, if an NFL key starter is out, like a Deshaun Watson or Russell Wilson or Pat Mahomes, what should that do to the line? I just think it's different from NFL football to college football. I mean, you're talking about it. I'm going to get people pulling punches and pulling no punches on this feed today, but I think Nick Saban, considering the modern era, you have to call him the greatest head football coach of the modern era, dynasty, current way of doing it, maybe even take that all the way back to 1990. I know some Spurrier fans probably wouldn't like that. But for me, I think Nick Saban is worth that much because I think you take away Nick Saban. I mean, you've seen some of this reporting now, guys. He makes the halftime calls. He makes the kick calls. He makes the rah-rah speech. He gives everybody those A-double hockey sticks or A-double dollar sign chewings on the sidelines when they're not calling enough really good ball plays. I think Nick Saban, not just the brilliance of his football mind, but I think it's kind of like, folks, this isn't war, but this is like a brilliant military leader that's on the battlefield versus not. I mean, I think Nick Saban is the Alabama football program, and I think he's kind of like the rising tide that lifts all boats in that program. I think that's at least 3 or 4 points difference,
Mike Griffith, what do you think, more or less than a field goal?
Yeah, I mean, from a perception standpoint, I think that's probably right. But in this, and Jeff is right about all these things that Nick Saban has meant. I mean, the next time he beats a top 25 team, it'll be 86. That will tie Joe Paterno for the most top 25 wins ever. He's obviously won national championships at more than one program. He couldn't win it at the school that I went to at Michigan State. You got a group in East Lansing that remember that he ran away from Michigan because he didn't think he could ever beat Michigan in East Lansing. But if you give him facilities and players, he's obviously very good, and I think he's important. But in this wacky, wild way, I think this is going to work for Alabama. I think the pressure goes off of Alabama now, and it creates a vacuum where these kids and Nick is going to challenge them, and they're going to try and win without their fearless leader. And I think those assistant coaches are going to feel a little bit more room to operate and be a little more carefree. And I think it makes Alabama a little bit more unpredictable, because if anybody knows Nick Saban and how his mind works, it's Kirby Smart. But how well does he really know Steve Sarkisian?
Connor, what do you think? More or less than a field goal?
I'm going to say more here. I think you can look back and now, granted, with Saban, most of the work, and you and I were talking about this off air today, he wins most of the time Monday through Friday in the work he's put in there. And with what Alabama does and him testing positive on Wednesday and that getting out there on Wednesday, the fact that he was still at Mondays and Tuesdays practices means most of this game plan has already been implemented and the players understand it. But I think the in-game decision-making for me, I think, is one aspect where most of the time for Alabama, it doesn't come into play just because they're that much better than teams. But you look at some of the stuff he's done, even specifically against Georgia, obviously the Tua for Jalen swap out in the 2018 national title game comes to mind. And that was a pretty easy decision to make. I think you look back to the 2012 SEC championship game, there was a play during that game where Eddie Lacy has a big touchdown run, and Georgia very clearly could not stop Eddie Lacy. They could not tackle him. They could not bring him to the ground. Lacey scores a touchdown. Instead of traditionally kicking the extra point, Saban decides for no real earthly reason, hey, I'm going to go for 2 here because I don't believe Georgia can stop Lacey. They get the 2-point conversion. That ends up mattering at the end of the game when Georgia needs a touchdown instead of a field goal to tie Alabama there. So I think with some of the stuff you've seen him do in-game, the in-game decision-making he makes, I think that's a big difference from a guy from Steve Sarkisian who was not a great coach at Washington or USC in terms of on-field game day decision-making prospects.
So maybe I'm on an island by myself, but I'm actually going to say that Saban's impact on this game in particular is less than that. I don't think that Saban's worth as much as 3 points the final score. I think this game it's worth less. And Jeff, I'll go back to what you said a moment ago. I had a chance to talk to Barrett Jones today. Barrett Jones, one of the more decorated players that Nick Saban's ever played for. We're going to play this as a part of our pregame coverage this weekend on the Dog Nation video channels. But Barrett Jones, who's now an ESPN radio analyst, made the assumption that at this stage of Saban's career, he's not involved in the offense at all anymore. That completely belongs to Steve Sarkisian. And thus far, the offensive results have been pretty good. So when you've got a coach who's only impacting half the game plan on game day as it is, then I think that reduces his overall impact on this. I don't expect Alabama to play worse without Nick Saban on Saturday, assuming he truly isn't there. And right now you would obviously assume that to be the case. I don't expect Alabama to play worse without him in this game. I think it's still a tough game for Georgia to win. I think it's telling they'll still be a point spread underdog going in to Tuscaloosa on Saturday. I think that I am maybe alone amongst our quartet here of thinking that Saban's individual impact on this game is not as big as it's being made out to be.
So, Brandon, let me trumpet what Connor said there. I think that's a very good point, that everybody thinks it's Nick Saban with fire and brimstone and ice water in his veins on game day that's going to make the difference. I applaud the point Connor made there, because Monday through Thursday, especially installs, I think you miss that Nick Saban brilliant head coaching acumen on multiple days. And let me take it to another step. When you think about Nick and what he's meant to Alabama and all the brilliance of the program. I mean, you've got a guy here that he's still on the defensive side of the ball, like you said, Brandon. So what he does is he makes Georgia's weakness a little bit stronger, because the Alabama game plan and trying to find a way to stop Georgia's receivers and Stetson Bennett and the offensive line, suddenly, Alabama's a little left-handed there now, trying to counter what Georgia's trying to do offensively. And it makes Alabama's ability to stop Georgia, which most brilliant minds, including I would think most on this panel, would think Alabama's ability to stop Georgia on offense will be one of the key points of this game.
So let me ask all three of you questions. Connor, go ahead and say something first. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing, and this is maybe a reason why I do believe it has a bigger impact with the things we've seen from Kirby Smart as a head coach. He's been really, really good in big games, for the most part, making second half adjustments, tweaks that allow his team to either come back and retake a lead or sort of blow a game out of the water. I think you saw that last week against Tennessee. You saw that in the 2017, or I guess the 2018 Rose Bowl against Oklahoma. But against Saban, for whatever reason, you didn't see that. And now I think with Saban out there, not able to make the second half adjustments for Alabama, I think that's a particular area where Georgia might have a real advantage now over Alabama. And I think that's where the points that Saban would potentially bring a loss for Alabama.
So we've actually got a fairly interesting side-by-side comparison here. I want to ask each of you this question. And Mike, I want to start with you. Last week, middle of the week, we found out that LSU was not going to host Missouri, was going to have to go to Columbia. And there was a dramatic point spread shift when that happened. LSU went from about a 3-touchdown favorite down to about a 2-touchdown favorite. Immediately, a touchdown was subtracted off that point spread once you moved the venue. Much bigger move than what we've seen thus far with Georgia and Alabama, which leads to this question. I want you to hear what I'm asking you here. Would you rather face would you rather face Alabama in Athens with Nick Saban on the sideline, or go to Tuscaloosa and not have Nick Saban coaching if you wanted the best chance of winning? Mike, what do you think? What do you think?
If I was Georgia,
yeah,
I'd rather face Nick Saban in Athens. But I'm kind of with you, BA. I may not have been very clear in my point. I do think from a perception standpoint, but what I'm saying is I think in a weird way this is going to work for Alabama. So I'm saying that no, I don't think in practice, but I understand the perception. Now, if this were a season or 3 games, that's different. But we're talking about a one-shot deal against Georgia specifically this week. And because of the familiarity that Kirby and his staff have put in the entire year, you know that this game is always on the back burner, and not having Saban there all of a sudden is like the pitcher you thought you were going to face just got scratched.
Yeah.
You're not facing Glavine after all. You're facing Steve Avery. And you're going, well, wait a minute.
Or Clayton Kershaw in Game 4, as it turns out, for the Atlanta Braves here in just a couple of
But it might be
minutes.
Poison Avery in the 1991 NLCS, because Steve Avery was humming that thing in there back then, man.
So, Jeff, the same question to you. You have great respect for what you think Saban brings to a one-game scenario. You can play him in Athens, or you can go to Tuscaloosa and have him sit out. Which of those is the more winnable game for Georgia in your mind? Is Saban worth more than home field advantage?
Yeah, I guess my mind goes two ways. If you want to ask me that question in this scenario, 2020, certainly I'll face Nick Saban. I'll face Georgia. Georgia meaning Georgia will go to Tuscaloosa and face Alabama in Tuscaloosa right now in 20,000 in Bryant-Denny. Because what you're doing is you're reducing that home crowd, and you're also reducing the greatest coaching mind of our time. I think you take both of those off, and I would even do that with 110,000 in Tuscaloosa as well. I think you take the biggest chess piece in this game, which is still Nick Saban, off this board, because I don't think a lot of people still think, can Georgia beat Alabama, as much as it's, can Georgia beat Nick Saban? The program, everything he's built. And let's just look at this the other way too. Steve Sarkisian making the call on 4th and short, or 4th and 1 from his 35. Steve Sarkisian wanting to go for 2. Steve Sarkisian, an offensive-minded coach, going to make a lot of these game management decisions. I just don't think that. I think Alabama can weather a lot of things. They can weather the loss of a safety. They might even weather the loss of Mac Jones with the brilliant Bryce Young behind him. I just don't think they can. They can weather Nick Saban, and to say that he can, very candidly, very easily, would diminish his reputation as one of the greatest minds in the game.
Connor, you have a thought on this topic?
I do. So one, I would just like to clarify, Jeff keeps saying he's the greatest coach of our generation. He's the greatest college coach. If Nick Saban were really the greatest coach, he'd be doing it at the NFL level. Two, to answer BA's question here.
Listen, there's an entirely – hold on. I'm going to let you finish your point. I'm going to be Kanye for a minute. I'm going to let you finish. But there's an entirely different narrative out there about what could have been true for Nick Saban. And listen, I'm not – the last thing I'm going to do is be a Saban apologist the week before Georgia plays his ragtag bunch in Tuscaloosa. But there's an entirely different narrative that can be cast about the NFL situation had he ended up with Drew Brees instead of Dante Culpepper. And I'm going to leave that at that.
Anyway, back to my original point. I would say that if you're Georgia, you'd rather face them in Tuscaloosa without Saban than in Athens. One, in part because, and to go back to the LSU-Missouri game last week, I think it's very different when you're a team that's expecting a home game, and then later in the week you have to completely change everything to go travel on the road. I think that's a little bit of a more difficult situation than what Georgia and Alabama are dealing with here, too. And I think Jeff's point about this being a reduced crowd environment, yes, it's still going to be loud. I expect it'll be closer to something we see at Texas A&M last week. I think the crowd is still going to matter, but it's not quite the same effect. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the Kirby Smart Alabama thing, it is much more a Nick Saban specific thing than it is particularly maybe an Alabama thing.
It's Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. That was Connor Riley. We got Mike Griffith, Jeff Sintel here as well. My name is Brandon Adams. Good to have all of you with us. And a huge thanks to Georgia Farm Bureau for making it all possible. Georgia Farm Bureau right now doing a great thing to support the agricultural community here in our state with the I Farm, I Vote Georgia campaign. We all know how important the agricultural community is to the state of Georgia. So much of the food that we eat on our tables each and every night comes from Georgia's farms and Georgia's farmers. And they want to have their voice heard as we head towards Election Day. And that's what I Farm, I Vote Georgia is all about. So if you go to the website, ifarmivotega.com. That's ifarmivotega.com. You can learn all about that. You can hear interviews with candidates. You can hear the issues that matter to Georgia's agricultural community and its farmers. Georgia Farm Bureau stepping up in a big way to support Georgia's farmers, to give them a voice. It's ifarmivotega.com. You can check that out today. All right, let's move on here to topic 2 on Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. Interesting rumblings coming out of Tuscaloosa over the course of the last couple of days. There was an official statement released by Alabama today where one of the head athletic trainers quotes Nick Saban doing fine, so to speak. That's the word we got. I should point out that as we're doing this show, Nick Saban will also be doing his weekly radio show. He's expected to be doing that remotely from his home tonight. There is a chance that Saban could say something over the course of the next couple of minutes regarding the Georgia game that gets some attention. But, Mike, a couple things here jumped out to me today. First of all, Cecil Hurt, columnist of the Tuscaloosa News, goes on the Feinbaum show. He's quoted on there as saying that essentially Alabama's looking at pulling out all the stops right now, figuring out some way that Nick Saban can be involved in this game on Saturday, even though kind of the cold, bold reading of the rule book on this would say that he's not 90 minutes before until 90 minutes after the game allowed to have any contact with what goes on at the stadium. There's also Aaron Suttles, veteran, longtime Alabama reporter, saying that there is still a chance that Nick Saban could coach from the sidelines on Saturday, based on the fact, I'm assuming anyway, that he's currently asymptomatic. He has a chance to go through a series of tests. If those tests come back negative, as unlikely as that might be, maybe there's still a small needle that could be thread and Saban could still coach on Saturday. As a way of talking through all of this, let me make sure I get fully dressed for this. I got to get my tinfoil hat on and get ready to have this discussion, because I've been saying this now for quite some time. If Saban is not coaching on the sideline like a regular coach, I become very suspicious of any contact he could have as an outsider with what's going on the sideline. To me, something about that just doesn't quite add up. So what do you make of the chatter kind of since we've learned that Saban's tested positive for the coronavirus in terms of what, if any, role he's going to have on Saturday? Mike, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to have any role on game day before the 90 minutes. Just reading that interpretation, he's not allowed to, unless he's in the coach's box, unless they can have a COVID-proof coach's box, right? With Nick Saban being the bubble boy in the Bryant-Denny Stadium press box, and the oxygen goes into him and the oxygen doesn't go out or something where he can't spread anything. But no, I don't think so. I think this is a game that based on when he tested positive, that tells me he likely got it traveling. That's been the popular theory when you look at a lot of these COVID-19 cases, and teams have gotten it when they've gotten on airplanes and traveled places or gotten on buses because of the close proximity when you travel. And therefore, I do think it's still fresh enough that he will not be outside of that window, which I believe has been deemed to be 10 days if you're someone who's been contacted with it, and 14 if you came into contact per SEC interpretation. So that's a long way of saying I think it's much ado about nothing, and I don't think he's going to be coaching at the game or influencing coaching decisions within that window.
Well, I've got my tinfoil hat on for a reason here. Let me just remind folks, I'm seeing a lot of comments on YouTube of, oh, well, the rule says blah, 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 blah. Let me remind you that the SEC just ignored one of its rules 2 weeks ago, that they gave all these transfers within the league eligibility based on a new interpretation of an old rule. The idea that Alabama is not currently trying to get this rule interpreted in a slightly different way because of the, what was it they said the other day, Mike, unusual circumstances of coronavirus? If you don't think Alabama's trying to pull an unusual circumstances of coronavirus trick on this thing right here to see if they can get the SEC to ignore another rule, at least the second one they would have ignored this month, listen, I just don't know what to tell you. Connor, go ahead.
Look, Nick Saban learned from the best coach of the last generation, NFL or college, in Bill Belichick. And what Bill Belichick is known for is knowing the absolute minutia details of the rule book. And I absolutely believe that Alabama practices that same way. They know what the rules are, and they know exactly how to skirt around them without getting in trouble. Do I believe he'll be coaching from the game? No, I don't. Do I believe that he'll be, wheeled out there on like an old substitute teacher day box coming in and he's got it zoomed in on a TV there? No, I don't think they'll do that. Do I think that maybe Alabama coaches have to wear some of those tinfoil caps that BA is wearing so Saban can't communicate with them over the headset somehow? Maybe. I expect with Alabama and Nick Saban, I don't expect him to violate any rules. However, I expect them to go all the way up to the line, find out what that line is, and figure out how Saban can be involved with game day.
Jeff, what do you think?
So on all the tinfoil and all the conspiracies thing going around, I think what it is what Saban has to have, 3 consecutive negative tests in order for that to be confirmed.
I think it's 3. Yeah.
So he's got to test, get a reading on Thursday, get a reading on Friday, get a reading on Saturday. I think the last one would come on Saturday unless it's a rapid test. Mm-hmm. I think that's the only way he plays a viable part in the game plan. I don't see him FaceTiming Pete Golding. I don't see him FaceTiming Sarkisian to get into a cover zero look or to bring the backer on the edge or come with a pinch or a twist stunt. If he sends a text message to that, I don't think those rules will be broken. I just keep coming back to it's almost like you have to be a poster boy for the league right now. And to me, I think it takes – I agree with the points that Mike said earlier. It takes all the pressure off Alabama. But here's what it does to this game for me. I think we always went into this game thinking, oh, Georgia will be a lot different by the time they face each other in December. Georgia will be better. Georgia will be demonstrably better from the team that went to Tuscaloosa in October. Take Nick Saban, take that big chess piece off the board, and you wonder how much better Alabama is going to be now for all those many reasons. And we start thinking about, is it 3 points? Is it 4 points? Is it 6 points? Just imagine going to Jacksonville without Kirby Smart. How would Dog Nation feel about that? Just imagine facing Florida and Jacksonville without Dan Mullen. These guys are the identity of their programs for a reason. They're the guy that gives that.
Well, Florida went to Texas A&M last week without its defense, so I guess coaching without Dan Mullen would be too far of a cry from that.
Well, I think as long as they bring Kyle Trask and Kyle Pitts, I think that's their hope for winning every football game this year. But for me, you look at all those things, and that's the reason why they recruited all these guys. They fired and brimstone all those guys. It's the reason why Kirby is such an engine for Georgia football that Scott Sinclair has to hold on to his britches during most games. I don't know if you have those britches moments anymore with the belt during COVID-19, but to me, there are all these things here that says, man, Alabama might not even have the major part of its defensive game plan to try and stop Georgia installed or prepared by the time the game arises.
Can I give you one more tinfoil take, and then I'm done with my tinfoil conspiracies? And I'm just going to leave this out there and walk away from it. I always thought it was really telling before the 2017 national championship game played in Atlanta, practice for Georgia the day before that game scheduled to take place in Atlanta. Georgia got on a bus, drove back to Athens to practice in a controlled environment. I always thought it was very interesting that Georgia chose to leave the city it was supposed to practice in. Alabama practiced in Atlanta, obviously, the way that any team traveling for a national championship game would. I always thought it was very interesting that Georgia went back to Athens to practice there that day. And me in my tinfoil hat, I'm just going to leave that at that.
How long did you spend getting that tinfoil hat ready?
All right, well, let me just show you this. If I take off the tinfoil, here's what you got. Old school Atlanta Braves, baby. Chop on.
Is that
Chop on? Game 4. Now, you should know this. I'm also upstairs. By the way, I have no TV up here because I'm not rich like Jeff is. I've got no TV in the upstairs, so I won't know what the Braves score is until I get downstairs, unless one of y'all put it in the comment section. Hopefully the Braves don't give up 2 touchdowns in the first inning like they did last night.
They'll put it in the comment section, as I learned on Tuesday night.
What were you about to say, Jeff?
Clayton Kershaw. That's not an oil painting of Tommy Lasorda over your shoulder there, is it, Brandon, or anything like that, right?
No, it's not. It's not.
Very
it's not
dignified and classy.
All right, it's a Cover 4 Live presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. I'm Brandon Adams. That's Jeff Sintel, Mike Griffith, Connor Riley. Glad to have all of you with us here this evening. All right, so one of the things I'm seeing when I'm perusing the comment section, I address this a lot on Dog Nation Daily today. And I want to kind of move in this kind of a broad topic of like what it means for Georgia if it beats Alabama on Saturday. And, Connor, I'll begin with you on this because I think you understand the perspective of fans a little bit here. Fans are worried that they're not going to get credit, so to speak, if Georgia wins. Kirby Smart in particular won't be credited with winning against his old boss, Nick Saban, becoming the first former Saban assistant to beat Nick Saban. I have said before, that's total nonsense. Whatever you decide is true is what's true here. You can't let Alabama fans or, pro-Alabama media dictate the narrative around this game. I have proclaimed, yes, this will be Nick Saban's first loss to a former assistant if he loses the game on Saturday. I've already decided that. And to the Georgia fan, and I'm going to let you talk in a minute, I promise, but to the Georgia fan who's worried about not getting credit, they wouldn't give you credit anyway. They'd blame it on officials. They'd say it was a regular season game and not the SEC championship. Opposing fans in the SEC aren't really in the business of giving each other credit for stuff anyway. So with that in mind, on topic number 3 here, what do you think is at stake for Georgia? Or what can be earned by Georgia by winning on Saturday?
First, I'd like to point out that Dennis Dodd of CBS Sports is reporting that this game will count on Saban's record. Two, to your point, stop
the first
worrying.
time Dennis Dodd's tweeted something I've liked in about a year. He was worth waiting for that one.
Two, if you're a Georgia fan, earlier today, Twitter was down for about an hour. And I can tell you it was maybe the best part of my year. Stop worrying about what other fans say. Go out there on Saturday, watch Georgia play, root for them to win. And if they win, celebrate it like you would celebrate any win over Alabama. Celebrate it like any team would celebrate a win over Alabama. This is still the most talented team in college football based on, recruiting rankings. And I would also say based on NFL draft potential. That offense is loaded. If Georgia finds a way to beat them, Nick Saban or not, that is still a monumental accomplishment for Georgia. And you can absolutely bet that it will be used and pitched as something to recruits. Hey, we are just as good as Alabama. We just went out there and proved it on the field. I don't care that Saban's not there. Yes, I think that has an impact on the game on Saturday, but a Georgia win over Alabama is still a Georgia win over Alabama, regardless of whether or not Saban is there.
Mike, you agree with that? Is this a loss for Saban if the Tide goes down Saturday?
No, Connor, if somebody beat the New England Patriots without Bill Belichick, is it still a win over the New England Patriots?
Yes, of course. And plus, that's sort of the thing. You've seen without Tom Brady, not just this year, but in years past when he was suspended for a garbage reason for Deflategate, they still went out there and played well and won, and then they ultimately lost a game. So just because, the face of the program is not there, the thing that's made Nick Saban so great, the thing that I think is going to make Kirby Smart so great, the thing that makes Bill Belichick so great is the institution that they have set up, that the machine essentially runs itself. And while Nick Saban's not there on game day, he's done everything else to set Alabama up for what they're going to do on Saturday.
Mike, you agree with that?
I think I'd have to agree with one of our commenters, James Crump here, BA. I don't think Georgia will get the proper credit if they beat Alabama without Nick Saban. I mean, I don't know how you could. I mean, let's face it, as Jeff has pointed out, the perception of Nick Saban and all the games that he's won, it's not the same as beating him with on the side. It kind of makes it hollow. It would be a hollow win over Alabama. Well, that's great. And I think Georgia fans should feel that way. But if you're asking about the national perception and the average Joe, they'd go, well, Nick Saban wasn't on the sideline because the perception is Kirby can't beat Nick. Like you said earlier, it's more about Kirby and Nick than Kirby and Alabama.
I'm going to come close to the screen for this because I want my words to be heard in their full volume and full effect.
As if that never happened before.
The national media hasn't been right about anything related to college football in more than a year. I don't give a flying flip what they think about Nick Saban compared to Kirby Smart, because this isn't, to me, a mano battle between the two guys. If that was the case, they could just fight. What this is about building a program. And frankly, when you look at the strength of the Georgia program on display on Saturday, assuming they win, obviously if they lose, then, Georgia fans going to have some wounds to lick here. When you look at the strength of the Georgia program, obviously great on defense, hoping to prove that it can also be formidable on the offensive side of the ball. By comparison, you see erosion in the Alabama program. And even if Nick Saban's not there, he is responsible for what his program has become. The fact that there were rumors this week that his defensive coordinator, Pete Golding, was going to be replaced. Nick Saban's responsible for that. This is his program that he's overseen, and that's the point that it's at right now. The fact that they don't have a Jeremy Pruitt or a Kirby Smart to turn to as a fill-in coach on a day like this on Saturday, because that guy, that kind of gravitas amongst the assistants just doesn't exist there anymore. Saban's responsible for that. Saban has built the program up to where it is right now, that if a loss occurs on Saturday, it'll be Saban who has contributed to that by the ways in which he's let certainly the physicality of his program erode. And if the national media doesn't see that, then you can add that to the canyon of things that they have been wrong about over the course of the last few months.
Who would Georgia turn to that's a successful head coach that's been proven?
No, I think that Georgia's got no shortage of people it could put out there in a game like this. I'd have no problem with Dan Lanning. I'd have no problem with Matt Luke. I'd have no problem with Del McGee. There's no shortage of people that I could see Georgia turning to manage the game for one day. And frankly, I think all of them, while I think that Steve Sarkisian's been a good offensive coordinator in terms of managing the full breadth of a program, I can promise you I trust any of the guys that I just mentioned over Sark to do that for one game.
Yeah, I like Dan Lanning. I think he'll be gone in a year to another big-time program. But Sark has coached at Washington and USC, and Georgia's got Todd Monken, who coached at Southern Miss and Matt Luke, who coached at Ole Miss. So I think I'm kind of lost on that point. I agree Georgia has the better staff right now, certainly better continuity. I think Georgia has more talent than Alabama. I know Connor said earlier that Alabama had the most talent. I think Georgia is the most talented team in this game, and I think Georgia should win this game. I'm not convinced that they're going to be able to.
Well, we'll talk about that part of it in a second, about what's actually going to unfold on Saturday, because I think that's worth getting into as well. Jeff, how about the larger point, though, of kind of what's at stake for Georgia? I'm big of the belief that, listen, I don't care about how anybody spends this, but for you, from your own perspective, how do you see the weight, the meaning of all of this on Saturday?
So I got a wild take here. Sometimes I think in life, the truth, when we see it, we know we have to see that variance and that outcome to see what it is. So I started thinking about this when we were talking about this point. And first of all, forgive me, folks, but I'm just going to go with some variance between the three opinions that we've seen so far here. But it's actually something I kind of feel about, I believe in. Let's say Alabama beats Georgia handily this weekend, 31-17, something like that, without Nick Saban on the sidelines. One, be tremendously deflating for Georgia. But two, I wonder if people will go, was it Nick Saban's program that beat Georgia, or was it Steve Sarkisian that beat Kirby Smart in Georgia? I just wonder how that would be spin, the perception of it, if Alabama's unstoppable on offense and then the defense is a leaky sieve, then most would probably think that Steve Sarkisian beat Kirby Smart in Georgia because that was an offensive-minded game plan. But it was still the Alabama program. I think it would be funny if Georgia comes out of this outcome with a win, and then Alabama has their Tyler Simmons was on sides moment in terms of saying Nick Saban was a false positive. I think it would be a very bad big picture for Georgia to lose this game with Nick Saban not having an imprint on this game whatsoever, even if there's some great post-game revelation from Sarkisian that says, you know, Nick Saban put this whole defense in together. That's how we stopped Georgia, yada, yada, yada. That's how we pressured Stetson Bennett. I just have a hard time handing a loss coaching record-wise, no matter what the great Dennis Dodd says. If Nick Saban's not on the field, if Nick Saban's not part of half the week of game prep, he's not making the in-game decisions, there is an interim coach installed. I don't know how that would go as a loss or a win on Nick Saban's coaching record. I know that might be technicalities. But I think it becomes down to, is the Georgia football program right now bigger than the Alabama football program? And I think it still goes back to something we said 2 months ago. I just don't think Georgia's offense is in the shape to beat a team like Alabama at this point of the season.
Connor, I'm going to let you talk. Go ahead, Mike. No, go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
When Johnny Majors missed a few games at the beginning of the 92 season and Philip Fulmer filled in, he got credit for the wins. Now, the difference is obviously that Johnny had a heart attack and was out. But I don't know how this could go on Nick Saban's coaching record if he doesn't coach the game. That doesn't make sense to me.
Let me tell you why it will, because if they don't make the playoff again this year, he's going to retire. So that'll tell you why it's going to go on his all-time record, because he's going to know that he has seen the perch that he's enjoyed at the top of the SEC. He's going to see it slip away. So Saban will tell you what this game wins when he decides, you know what, maybe it's time to go spend time with whatever family, whatever thing he's going to make up that he's going to do. That's how you know the loss counts to him and bothers him, when he's sitting at home watching the playoffs on TV for the second consecutive year, when he chooses to retire. That's when you can look back and say, well, I guess that Georgia win back in October really was the passing of the torch. Kind of go ahead.
I'm going to make my final point very brief and very clear here. I do not care about the debate of should this count on Saban's record or not. If you are a Georgia fan, if you're a Georgia player, if you are associated with the Georgia program, just win on Saturday. It doesn't matter what else anyone else says out there.
How about, Connor, what Jeff said a moment ago? I do think this is a very fair point, that there's clearly something at stake for Georgia on the other side. It would be really painful when it seems like everything is set up for you. Now, Georgia's got its own adversity to overcome, still a relatively inexperienced starting quarterback, still a relatively new offense. All those things I think really matter here. But as Jeff set it up, you know, it's a mostly empty stadium. It's likely the absence of Nick Saban from a coaching standpoint. This is an awful Alabama defense. If Georgia, even as a point spread underdog, doesn't win that game, that just kind of adds to the lore of what has been a pretty unenjoyable series of history between these two programs since Kirby Smart has been head coach. I don't deny that there is clearly some negative feelings and emotion that you're trying to keep at bay on Saturday.
So, yes. However, I will say there is still the very real possibility of Georgia seeing Alabama again at the end of the season. And a loss on Saturday in that aspect, I don't think would be quite as damaging as, say, a loss in an SEC championship game. One, because I believe an SEC championship game loss would potentially keep them out of the playoff. But two, I think that loss in that truly big stage, admittedly, as the point all just laid out there, it is a little bit of a smaller stage tonight. And, you know, everyone remembers the Thrilla in Manila between the Frazier and Ali fight, but nobody seems to remember that Frazier actually won one of those earlier fights. I'm forgetting which one because it was long before I was born. But you don't need to win every time to make it a classic. But I think to really establish and set trends, you do have to win the big one.
This is also before I was born, but I believe Frazier won. Mike, I know you were alive for this. I believe Frazier won the first, and Ali won the second too. Mike, is that right? I think you covered that. Didn't you cover that?
No, I wasn't watching.
Did you do that one for AP?
No, I didn't see that.
I'm messing. I'm playing with you. But you did bring up a good point earlier, which is actually how Georgia tries to find a way to win this game on Saturday. So it sounds like you're pretty skeptical that Georgia gets it done, and I think that's fair. I mean, as I said before, Georgia's a point spread underdog in this game for a reason. But if you laid out the scenario by which Georgia wins, what is that in your mind?
Turnover-free football. You know, don't turn the ball over. Don't give up big plays. I like the defense a lot. I think teams with great offenses have a greater margin for error than teams with great defenses. As we've seen, they've had Alabama beat twice, BA. They had them down by 2 touchdowns, but because Alabama had a good offense, they were able to turn it on. We look at this Georgia offense. They've only completed 2 passes that have gone for more than 30 yards out of 85. I mean, they don't have a deep strike, fast strike, explosive offense, not to this point, certainly. I believe I want to say there's been 18 catches of 16 yards or more. Kyrus Jackson has 10 of them. Nobody else has more than 3. So I think if Stetson can play turnover free, and if Georgia can run the ball and control the clock, then I think they can win the game. But I'm skeptical of playing turnover-free football. I think Georgia's been living right. There's been 3 or 4 close calls on interceptions. It could have easily gone the other way. And honestly, I'm also afraid of the penalty flag. Alabama throws the ball a lot, and a lot is going to be determined by how they call that game in the secondary and what's pass interference and what's not.
Jeff, what do you think? What does Georgia need to do to win on Saturday?
I like that last point Mike said there. He even made it well without leaning into the TV, leaning into the camera, really big, bold, and braggadocious. I'm going to go with a different script. I think Georgia needs one score generated by its special teams or its defense. And to me, in my mind, that's what covers the differences now between whatever those 6 points Vegas said that to me have now shrunk down to maybe 1 or 2 points without Saban. Got to remember, every one of these games, guys, has been decided by a cojones call by the head coach of Alabama. And that was when he'd seen enough bad play from Jalen Hurts and he saw that he needed to bring him in, or when he saw that he needed Jalen Hurts to get the chance against an ineffective, Tua who'd been banged up or whatsoever. I just think that guy, that general on the field, is not going to be able to make those calls in a very tight ball game. And I think it sets up very well now for Georgia. Before this, Nick stuff, I was thinking, can Georgia beat Alabama yet? I don't know, because you got to have a lot of respect to that Alabama program. But I thought they could keep it within 6 or 7 points, given that point spread. Now, I think most of the momentum, most of the real world momentum in terms of things, you could say Alabama's playing fast with fast money or whatever. Again, I know many on this feed, I would love for them to say oh no, brother. Georgia facing Alabama without Kirby Smart would be a major blow. Just in terms of those guys are I said it earlier, the engine, the heartbeat, the sass, the brass, the balls of the program. I just guess I wanted to say that in King's English. I think losing Nick Saban, facing Alabama in Alabama without that stadium and that crowd going bonkers, and a leaky defense, and without a safety, without some of their key players on defense that they normally have. I think one great point, look at Will Anderson, who's now a starter at Alabama. He was a 5-star coming out of Dutchtown High School. Georgia really liked Mikhail Sherman as their outside linebacker in this class. And then plus they really got hot on Will Anderson late. Now, Will Anderson, I've been told by people who would know, grew up a Georgia fan, and Georgia never offered him or never recruited him until really late. So a lot of his reason and rationale for going to Alabama was basically a comeuppance to Georgia. Say, hey, I'll go to Alabama. Georgia don't want me. I'll go get the team that knocks out Georgia every year. And you think about Will Anderson for a second, and this is why I'm making this point. I don't even know if Will Anderson would be on the field Saturday against Georgia. He's the starter, the first outside jack linebacker to ever start for Nick Saban amongst all those top-rated number 1 5-star laden recruiting classes. To me, that shows a clear difference in talent between the two rosters, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Give Georgia a touchdown in the special teams or a defensive arena. Richard LeCount, hello. And I think they can win that ball game in Tuscaloosa.
You know, Connor, I think you made a pretty good point the other day in talking about I think it was you said that you thought that Georgia needed to score 28 offensive. Was that you that said that 28 offensive points to win this game? Expound on that a little bit more. I think you said that on Dog Nation Daily this week. I thought that was a pretty good take.
Yeah, so the two big numbers for me here are 4 and 75. Can Georgia's offense score 4 touchdowns in this game? Because I believe they'll do enough of the other stuff, send turnovers, potentially set them up on good field position to kick the field goals that we know they're all going to still kick. So if you can get 4 offensive touchdowns in this game, I think that's going to go a long way to Georgia winning. I think the other number, 75 there, can you keep Najee Harris under 75 rushing yards? I'm going to mention Bill Belichick again here. When you watch those CBS broadcasts, Tony Romo says, you know, Jim, the one thing they're always going to want to take away, they're going to take away the thing you do best or the thing you want to do most. And I think in this game, it's Najee Harris. I think if Alabama wants to win this game, Georgia's going to make them do it with Mac Jones throwing the football. And if Georgia's able to limit Najee Harris's effectiveness in this game, which is a very big if, because in my belief, Najee Harris is the best running back in all of college football. If they're able to score 4 offensive touchdowns and hold Najee Harris under 75 rushing yards, I believe that is the key to victory. As far as whether or not they do that, earlier in the week when we did go with the flow, I took Alabama -6. If I were a gambler and I have put out feelers out there, I'd be very interested in putting some money down on Georgia money line right now.
Interesting. Very interesting. Mike, I would say that you may be the most skeptical person on the broadcast today. So I'll ask you, do you see a scenario in which Georgia can do what Connor said? We'll take the offense part of this first. Do you see a scenario in which Georgia can score 28 offensive points on Saturday?
Yeah, I do. I think if the defense scores a touchdown or like
it's got to be offense. No, it's got to be off. I'm asking for 28. I'm asking for 28 offensive points. 28 offensive points.
Well, so far they've scored 10 touchdowns and kicked 8 field goals. So against Arkansas, Tennessee, and Auburn, they're averaging less than 4 touchdowns a game. So I'm going to take the under on 4 touchdowns.
Alabama's also given up 30 a game now too. So you got to factor that part of it into it now.
I do. I don't think Georgia's offense is as good as Ole Miss's. I think that's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. I think
Ole Miss not the only team Alabama's played though this year. I mean, it's also Texas A&M, it's also Missouri.
Yeah, A&M's got a lot of experience. I'd take Kellen Mond over Stetson Bennett too. Missouri, not so much.
I'm not sure after the last 2 weeks I'd take Mond over Bennett, but I'm curious of your thoughts. I'm curious of your thoughts. Keep going.
Are you sure? I mean, if you disagree, I can just stop talking.
No, I want to hear what you're saying.
Okay, yeah. So I'm going to say no. I don't think they're going to score 4 touchdowns. I think they can score, but they could maybe score 3 with 3 field goals. I mean, 24-28. That's kind of what it feels like. I think they can sustain a couple of drives. I think they can find some balance. I'm hearing a lot more about Kenny McIntosh. I think Georgia's figured out Zamir White maybe shouldn't get 22 carries and other guys only get 6 or 8. I think you'll see more balance in the backfield since you've seen some of the younger guys make some more explosive plays. Kendall Milton looked very good, I thought. McIntosh, I'm hearing James Cook is back this week. Kind of wonder which one of him we're going to get, right? But I think there's ways for Georgia. Trey McKitty, I think, will be a big weapon. Alabama's had trouble. But Georgia hasn't played tempo yet, and they haven't thrown the deep ball. And those are 2 of the things that have really hurt the Alabama defense the most. So I'll be curious to see how Kirby Smart approaches it.
Jeff, that was the other thing that what Mike just mentioned there that Barrett Jones made pretty clear to me today is that he thought, because he did the Alabama Ole Miss game on radio last week, that the thing that bothered Alabama the most against Ole Miss was the speed with which Ole Miss played. Alabama could not get lined up. in that game. And I don't think Georgia can match that. I don't think Georgia wants to. Now, I was told by people who saw, the third and final scrimmage that Georgia played pretty fast during that scrimmage. So maybe there's a little bit of, a desire to be up tempo, but not the speed at which Lane Kiffin plays. I don't think that's an aspiration of Georgia to play that fast. So, Jeff, I guess my belief is that if Georgia finds the offense it needs on Saturday, it's not replicating the Lane Kiffin plan, at least my best possible guess on that.
No, I wouldn't say they were. I think the thing to remember, even though they went tempo, you saw Ole Miss with, I guess it was a Matt Luke constructed offensive line. Let's be kind and say that they're not a whole lot of 5 stars or the brilliance or the reputation of even Tennessee's offensive line that Ole Miss had. And they moved Alabama off the ball a lot. And I don't know, tempo means a whole lot in terms of getting guys lined up when they're pushing. They're getting that push. They're creating that separation off the line, creating some gaps. I think it comes back to this, and love to hear everybody's thoughts on this. I think most people would thought for Georgia to win this game, they'd have to score 28 to 31 points in Tuscaloosa. I think Nick Saban not being on the field to continue talking about this, and whether it's Pete Golding or Charlie Strong, or whether it's Joe Kynes, or you've got Bryant Denny Chimes and everybody on their cell phone making calls for Alabama. I don't care who it is. I think Georgia's ability to score 28 to 31 points on Alabama and Tuscaloosa just went up a lot. And I start thinking and I go, okay, I think the thing for Georgia, and I think it kind of solves a lot of those wounds that might kind of sounds like it's leaking or need to be addressed with some triage. I don't know what it is. They just got to get George Pickens ready to play this week. I think there's a reason why George Pickens is a 5-star, and maybe it seems like he's the guy that makes Georgia explosive and dangerous, can cover. I mean, Alabama's going to throw Patrick Surtain on him, and I think they're going to leave him with Patrick Surtain and not try to double him. I think they just kind of find a way. Now, there's some theories. I hear everybody all the time ask me, and they say, Stetson Bennett just doesn't look George Pickens' way. I think a lot of that has to do with George Pickens being in the place where Stetson Bennett expects him to be all the time on the field. And maybe he has a little bit more comfortability by knowing that Kearis Jackson is where he's going to be. I think this is a George Pickens game. I don't know if he's going to have many more games like the Baylor game left in his career at Georgia. I think this is a great place to start. I know this is a game that George Pickens has thought about playing well in that stadium all his life. If Mike wants to see Georgia get a little more explosive, if you've got a productive Kenny McIntosh and James Cook in the game and you're feeding the ball to George Pickens, I think Georgia certainly becomes a little bit more deadly on offense. And is it going to be deadly enough to be Matt Corral? I don't think so, but I think it can be deadly enough to get 31 to 35 points in Tuscaloosa.
Go ahead, Connor.
Well, so in harkening back to the Bear Jones interview you referenced today, do you guys know how many rushing yards Ole Miss ran for last week?
Since it's Kiffin at the helm, I'm assuming not many.
268. Jeff, pretty spot on there. 268. And Jones had said that was one of the more alarming things as well. And I don't know how much of that is tempo. I don't know how much of that is inexperience in that front seven where they are having to play guys like Will Anderson there. But if Georgia's able to successfully run the ball on this Alabama front, I think that does make things a lot more interesting.
All right, let me just do a couple things here really quick because I want to cram a bunch of stuff in here for a moment. The one thing about the receiver conversation, and Mike, I'll let you respond to this, that I think has been maybe the wrong narrative cast about it a little bit is, yes, you could have gotten more from George Pickens if you're Georgia this year. I've said I think that Pickens should be judged by the touchdowns he scores more so than the receiving yards they get. And Pickens got a couple touchdowns thus far this season. It'd be nice to see him get another one against Alabama on Saturday. But Kearis Jackson has as many receiving yards through 3 games as Dominic Blaylock had for a full year a year ago. And that's not to disparage Blaylock at all, but one of the big questions coming in the year was, how could Georgia replace Blaylock after he got hurt? Kearis Jackson has already essentially replaced what Georgia got from Blaylock a year ago. Shows me that this offense is functioning better right now than it was last season. I'm not denying that Pickens needs to be a bigger part of this. It's one of the reasons why I'm okay with Georgia occasionally forcing it in this direction. But I do think to fixate on what's not quite right with George Pickens maybe having huge numbers, I think does distract from the fact that Kearis Jackson as a receiver for Georgia thus far has been a revelation. There are not a lot of receivers in the Kirby Smart era who've gone 100-plus yards in back-to-back games, something that Jackson's been able to do for UGA thus far. So it is certainly a story of some successes mixed in with an offense that's still a little bit of work in progress. And, Mike, I guess I feel like that needs to be pointed out.
Yeah, the inconsistency is what's bothering me. I don't remember Georgia snapping the ball into the end zone and giving 7 points up. I don't remember, playing a team like Arkansas and trailing until there's 6 minutes left in the third quarter. Arkansas, there's been a lot of inconsistency, and Georgia's kind of had those stinker moments in every game. The second half, they only get 3 points against an Auburn team that's had its front seven gutted and is a shadow of what it was a year ago. And if Georgia can put it together, BA, and play that 60 minutes without those bad moments that we're not used to seeing, then if they can go 60 minutes and not turn the ball over and not gift wrap a touchdown or have those snap issues or fumbles or turnovers. And, the thing that scares me a little bit about this game is, Georgia scored 10 offensive touchdowns. They've attempted 8 field goals. They're kicking field goals and not scoring enough touchdowns. And I think you need touchdowns to beat Alabama. So I think that was a good question you asked earlier about will they get 4 touchdowns or 28 points in this game. So if they can play a full 60-minute game, then I'll feel a lot better about it. I don't think I'm ready to say, last year's offense with DeAndre Swift, that was DeAndre Swift brought an element to that game. I think about the game against Kentucky and the way DeAndre took that game over. I think about the Florida game and 12 of 18 on third down conversions and Cager with 152 yards. I think about the Notre Dame game, a top 10 win when the defense came through in the end. I'm not ready to say that yet. I want to see more, and this is a great proving ground. If Stetson Bennett can beat Alabama, he's an instant legend.
So, Jeff, I know you want to jump in here, and I'm going to let you. But can I just say this, because maybe I'm the only one. I'm honestly curious what all three of you think. Mike, it sounds like you disagree. I think what we've seen from Georgia for the last 2.5 games, maybe you'll subtract the first half against Arkansas, but I think that's way better than Georgia played for most of last season. You mentioned the Notre Dame game. On the basis of pregame expectations, Georgia fell way below that. They were 17-point favorites against Notre Dame. They barely won. Even if you disqualify the Kentucky game because it was raining, and heaven knows no one can do anything offensively when it rains at all, as we were told, last year, after that game's over. Even if you disqualify that, there were just lots of games for Georgia last year where they were just slogging around to do really anything. Even the Florida game, as much as I love it, if you took away Georgia's performance on third down in that game, they didn't do much offensively in that game really either. There were just most of the games last season where Georgia was lucky to find any offense whatsoever. DeAndre Swift's numbers even not quite as good as they've been in 2018. What I've seen for Georgia from the last, at the very least, the last 2.5 games, I'll even include the totality of the Arkansas game, this is better than most of what Georgia played last season, I believe.
The upside certainly is. Right now, Georgia ranks 5th in the league in scoring offense. Last year, they were 4th in the league in scoring offense. I thought they looked really good against Baylor. I thought George Pickens looked good with his 12 catches for 175 yards. I thought he was looking better than what Kearis Jackson has looked to this point. But when your quarterback doesn't have a strong enough arm to complete longer than a 30-yard pass, you need to rely on your slot receiver. And Kearis has been excellent. He's been a breakout player. I think Trey McKitty is an upgrade from what we had playing at Georgia last year. I don't think the offensive line is as good. I don't think the quarterback play is as good. And we've yet to see running back play as good as DeAndre Swift. But against Arkansas, Auburn, and Tennessee, they've gotten wins. I don't know if I think any of those teams are as good as Notre Dame and Florida was last year.
Well, against 4-8 South Carolina last year, they lost. So what they're doing so far this year is an upgrade for me. And you can't give me 4th in scoring last year when 55 of those points came against Murray State. There is no Murray State on this year's schedule. Go ahead, Jeff.
I guess I'm going to combine a couple of views here. Brandon, remember how we said before the year that it'd be awful hard for George Pickens to get to 1,000 yards in a 10-game season? Well, Kearis has 300 through 3 games. He is your George Pickens numbers. When you made the point earlier about him replacing Dominic, actually what he's doing is he's replacing the George Pickens production everybody was expecting. You've basically turned George Pickens into the number 2 receiver on this Georgia offense. I don't know. I think – see, it's funny. When Stetson Bennett started playing, I wanted to go back in my mind to when I saw both of those guys because they were in the same recruiting class in 2016. They were going through the same opening trials as everybody else. Stetson, folks, is actually older than Jake Fromm. And I was remembering what I saw, and then I went back to guys that have caught balls from both of them and have saw both of them in practices. Here's what I got. Jake had the layered arm. He had the guy he was the guy that could throw the guys open. He could hit the windows. He could drop it in over the layers of the defense. Stetson was the guy that would stick it in there. He would stick it in there over the middle. He would be the one always trying to throw bombs. He would be the guy trying to test guys. And you've seen that there's some throws here. And I'm going to go to another throw now from Stetson Bennett that impressed me this year. He put it right on Trey McKitty over the middle where it had to be absolutely on target where it needed to be. And that was a throw I'm sure a lot of people that are contrarians would have went, whoa, tight end, whoa, right over the middle of the field in contested coverage. That didn't used to happen in the Georgia program. Here's what I'm trying to say, folks. I think Stetson Bennett and Jake Fromm's arms are kind of similar in the grand scheme of things. One guy would have a higher rating in terms of certain throws. One guy would have a higher rating in terms of other throws. I think Georgia fans are still searching for that quarterback that can throw the deep ball, make the right reads, not throw interceptions, but also have some escapability as well. I think one of the things as we try to beat this dead horse to death is let me just lean in here for effect. We're spending a lot of time talking about this offense, but I think the winning recipe for Saturday is simply the offense giving enough on the field and on the scoreboard. Because really the game's going to be won by how Georgia holds down Alabama's offense.
Connor, you want to jump into this topic before we move on?
Yeah, I do. I would probably agree with BA here. I have, in comparison to Mike, I have been a little bit more impressed with what we've seen from the offense, especially from November of last year. I know Auburn, they lost Derek Brown, they lost Marlon Davidson. Georgia lost Andrew Thomas and Isaiah Wilson and DeAndre Swift and Jake Fromm. They lost a lot too, and they still came out. And they were up 24-0 in that game, and they dominated that. And I can certainly understand, them only scoring 3 points in the second half. But the offense didn't need to do more than that. They won that game in the first half when they came out and dominated there.
They also had the ball 3 times in the second half in that game as well.
And the this Tennessee team, I think, is still much improved from where it was a season ago. And they still, for all the complaining about Zamir White and how he played last week, they still ran for 190 yards, and they still scored a bunch. So they got the 4 touchdowns against Tennessee. So I still think, well, yes, this offense has a ways to go. It's not perfect. No one is saying that. I do think for what we've seen right now against an SEC slate, they are better than what they were doing last November against the likes of Auburn, A&M, and Missouri.
Yeah, they're certainly averaging more points in SEC play this year than they were a year ago. I think last year they averaged, fewer than 20 points a game in SEC play. So against SEC play this year, you're seeing, a better run all the way around. And I'll say this. As a fan here for a moment, what has made me more optimistic is this is a more impactful defense. They got after Jared Garantano a week ago. They really made the Tennessee offensive line look bad. They got after Bo Nix the week before that. This defense is much, limiting yards and points as it did a year ago. They just didn't really get after people all that much. But, man, this defense is just wreaking, to use an overused word here, they are wreaking havoc in the backfield, and that has been really fun to watch. All right, Cover 4 Live presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. Let me, as far as our topic number 4 goes, let's just hit this real quick. I don't have a whole lot of time for Corona Bologna, but let me just hit this for 1 second here. LSU, Florida postponed. Nick Saban test positive. Ole Miss, there's some rumblings about some positive tests there. I honestly haven't heard anything about that today. I'm not quite so sure there's anything new to report on that or not. If there is, I apologize for not being aware of it. Are you concerned, Mike, that there are cracks in the facade of the SEC's plan here with all the news that has seemingly piled up this week? And by the way, you can go on all kinds of corners of the internet, and there's all kinds of finger pointing, fan base towards fan base about program they think is lying. And there's just a lot of tense feelings right now about the corona around the SEC. Mike, is it a concern for you?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a concern because what if Florida has to postpone another game? Or what if one of Florida's opponents contacts the coronavirus? they've already used up that December 12th window for a makeup game, right? So then what do you do with the next time? That's the concern, is if there's multiple games that a team is affected by coronavirus cancellations. I suppose in hindsight, now that we see the Big Ten only has an 8-game schedule, maybe the SEC should have said, you know what? Maybe we should have scheduled yet another bye week and dialed it back a little bit. Maybe 10 games was too much. Maybe an 8-game SEC schedule, as per usual, would have been just fine.
Well, it sounds like Connor wants to jump in here too. So, Connor, you go ahead. Maybe you're about to say the same thing I'm going to say.
I was just going to ask, Mike, the Big Ten doesn't have any bye weeks. There's no bye weeks on their schedule. They're playing 8 straight games. So if they have to cancel one game, or even postpone one game, it gums up the whole schedule.
Yeah, but they have a formula at the end where they play 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In this case, this could affect the divisional standings. So just imagine, guys, let's play this out. Just for the sake of argument, let's say that Alabama beats Georgia. I know that it's hard to believe for some, but let's just say that the favorite does win, and what we're considering an upset in Georgia, apparently. And let's just say that Georgia contacts the coronavirus the week of the Florida game. When do you make it up? And what happens if Georgia slips up and loses another game and doesn't get the opportunity to play Florida? I mean, the way the East and the West is set up, it's kind of a scary scenario if there's multiple games missed. I'm not sure why that seems confusing to you, Connor. If there's another cancellation for Florida,
I'm not going to be patronized by you here, Mike. So please stop.
I'm not patronizing anything.
You are.
You challenged my theory.
Hold on.
It to you.
No, I mean, Mike, I think you're bringing up a good point. I guess what I would say is, for me personally, if Georgia didn't play Florida, I would view that as a sports tragedy, right? Like if you didn't get the head-to-head matchup with Florida, I'd view that as, in the sporting sense, a tragedy. I really want Georgia to play Florida. But if Florida and LSU, let's say it couldn't be made up, and all of a sudden what was supposed to be a 10-game schedule turned into some guys a 9-game schedule, or for some teams an 8-game schedule. Honestly, it's a fair question to bring up, but the SEC typically only plays an 8-game schedule anyway. So from that standpoint, as I mentioned before, Georgia's not playing Arkansas State this year, or Murray State, or whoever the team is in a given year. They're not playing those games. So I'm actually not that worried about the current scenario, even if there are more cancellations, because frankly, by having a 10-game schedule, which is the toughest schedule anybody's ever played in college football history, 10 SEC games, if it got turned into a 9-game schedule, if for a couple of teams it got turned into an 8-game schedule, I think that's the way that it's going to be. Now, you're going to come back and say, well, BA, what if Georgia got cost a spot in the SEC title game because it played a game that Florida didn't have to play? I'd really dislike that. That would really, really bother me. But I hope that I would have the maturity to say that it's more important to have a season this year than it is to have a season that just benefits Georgia. So I understand why all of a sudden the plan feels like it's becoming a little bit shaky here, but I don't know that I'm all that worried about if the end result of the season ends up looking a little bit different, because, frankly, giving some room for some cancellations is better than the alternative, I would say.
I agree. But my concern, when you ask me what the concern is if one team has more than one cancellation and they've already used up that December 12th weekend, and somehow that creates an imbalance. And with the Big Ten playing an 8-game schedule, had the SEC schedule maybe only been 8 games and started on September 26th, they would have had some more windows to make up games. And that's the point I was trying to make.
Jeff, what do you think about this? Are you worried at all? I mean, it's a lot of bad news in one week. I'll certainly acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think the things immediately that come to mind is, are there more bad news on the way from Ole Miss? Are there positive cases with Ole Miss? And then that would verify maybe there's some more coming down the pipe for Alabama. I've heard Mike mention a couple of times that Vanderbilt doesn't really have a strong appetite for any of this. Perhaps Vanderbilt players, scholarship guys, the acumen for athletics in that school is not as hardcore as other institutions in the SEC. What if they're bowing out? Creates some schedule flexibility to move everything around. That's a de facto, we're not playing this team anymore. You can slide that in there. I think there might be a lot of games when we start thinking about how the ripples in this pond could go. I think there's a lot of games that maybe really might not matter if a school's already lost 3 games in conference-wide play. Why do they need to make up their 9th and 10th games of the season? I think there's a way to kind of reassemble a lot of this. I believe, and I hope I'm not breaking any news. We all kind of think this, but I'd imagine most of these programs have went through 60 to 70% positive tests over the summer. That's just what I'm led to believe. Of course, nobody's releasing these facts. Of course, they're not out there widely distributed. I just think a lot of these young people ended up with the coronavirus over the first 6 to 8 weeks that they were training during those OTAs. Where I think when the SEC started establishing those thresholds about you got to have so many of these guys, have so many of these guys available, I think that maybe somehow that they felt that those were attainable going forward. And I think there's just so many things to think about now. If I would have had to be a betting man, and I know some people on this feed are, I think it's kind of a semi-impressive move for the SEC that they've gotten this far. And right now, these are the only cracks in the great plan to go forward. Somebody mentioned the Big Ten earlier. I also kind of wonder if the Big Ten and Pac-12 might get skittish if they see the SEC start postponing games and stopping activities and halting things, whether they jump back into the deep end as well this season, even though they've went back and forth all year long.
So real quick, final point from me on this topic. Connor, my belief was the SEC didn't want to play 10 conference games anyway. We had Tony Barnhart on Dog Nation Daily. I think he made the assumption the TV told him, no, we need at least 10 games. Otherwise, this contract ain't going to be what you think it's going to be at the end of the year. The envelope ain't going to be quite as heavy if you don't play 10 games. I don't think the SEC wanted to play 10 games anyway. I think the SEC wanted to play a 9-game conference-only schedule, and that's all they wanted to do. So the 10 games was already a compromise anyway. That's why, I mean, as it stands right now, no game is being canceled. We just have, a couple of games being moved. But if a game did get canceled, at that point in time, I'm of the belief you're just working back to the scenario which what the SEC preferred to begin with, which does make tabulating division winners potentially a little harder. I will not deny that. But 9 games is what the SEC wanted.
Well, if I could quote The Godfather Part 2 here, Hyman Roth, this is the business that the SEC had chosen to be in. This is the business that college football had chosen to be in. They knew it was going to be difficult to get a season done, but they still went out and they still tried to do it anyway, and they deserve to be commended for that. And I think now you're getting to a point where you're seeing the problems come up, and you have to start solving those problems. And I think they are. And you solve the one problem, and then you solve the next one. The NFL has sort of done this with what we saw with the Titans and the Patriots and the rejuggling of the schedule. You solve one problem, you solve the next problem. You keep solving problems until eventually you solve enough of them, and then you get the season completed. And I think that's sort of the trajectory that we're on.
And I'm sorry, finish your point. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, this isn't the last time we're going to hear postponements. I'm sure there might be a scenario where one team has 2 games postponed, and the SEC is going to have to figure out how they juggle that and how they move around it. But I also have confidence that the SEC, even just getting to this point in the middle of a pandemic, is why they're going to be able to solve those problems in the future.
Plus, I read all this stuff when I was a kid about all these teams that were like declaring national champions, all that kind of stuff. If Georgia gets head-to-head wins over the right teams, I'll just call the Georgia the national champions and we'll just move on. That's what worked back in like the 20s and the 30s. If you don't think I'll make a ring for Georgia, assuming it beats the right confluence of rivals here, that's all I really need to see anyway, especially in a year where the playoffs essentially a sham anyway.
If Alabama goes undefeated without Nick Saban, I'm sure they could feel justified in claiming a national title as well.
That's probably true. All right, it's Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. Connor Riley, Mike Griffith, Jeff Sintel. That's our Cover 4. Got a little bit of time here for Cover More. Your questions and comments to kind of get out of here. Mike, one of the things that I know that you enjoy talking about, and it's kind of come up in our comment section a little bit, is breakout player for this week. If Georgia wins on Saturday, who needs to be that breakout guy?
I think Kenny McIntosh. And, I think Kenny is a receiver and is a runner. I think he's an explosive player. I think he's got the potential to bring those explosive plays that have kind of been missing. As I've mentioned, you've only got 2 plays longer than 30 yards this season. Or, Jermaine Burton had a nice 42-yard run on that trick play sweep. And we saw a pass to Kearis Jackson for 49 yards. So I think Kenny McIntosh could be that guy with some volume. And I think that maybe Todd Monken could break him out a little bit.
Let me get some more comments here. Let me go over to YouTube here for a moment and see what people are saying over there. SEC Dog looking forward to the game on Saturday. How about Delvin McBride saying Dogs by 2 touchdowns on Saturday? It sounds like Jeff Delvin thinks the absence of Nick Saban's going to really matter. I don't know that I could conjure up enough optimism for a 2-touchdown Georgia win, but I see Georgia having a chance to win this one. Georgia's an underdog for a reason. It's not going to be easy, but I certainly will join Delvin in saying Georgia's got a chance to win this game on Saturday.
So let me bring up something. I know sometimes we try to think and overthink. I was looking up this point earlier in the week. Without Nick Saban, without Kirby Smart, without 5-star recruiting classes on both sides, actually Alabama still has signed more players than Georgia has over the last 4 cycles. We'll document that in a Dog Nation story to come. But let me go through this. This is a very interesting thought here. 2007, Georgia went to Tuscaloosa. They win 26-23. 2002, Georgia goes to Tuscaloosa. They win 27-25. 1994, Georgia goes to Tuscaloosa. They win 29-28. 1991, Georgia goes to Tuscaloosa. 10-0. What's the common thread by all these games in Tuscaloosa? They've all been 1-score games. They've all been 10-point games. Most of them have been decided by less than a field goal. You start thinking about breakout players for me. I think Jack Podlesny definitely needs to be a guy that would be the guy that can maybe be the guy that wins this game for Georgia. Now that sounds like a smart field goal university type dude to say that. I'm simply going to say if Georgia wins this football game, I think it's Richard LeCounte or Azeez Ojulari that make the difference in the game.
You left out one other factor that ties all those together. It all happened before I was in high school. I will say, though, I think this game, the breakout player, it's Adam Anderson or Azeez Ojulari. I know those guys have already broken out, but if those guys play like they have the last 2 weeks against a very good offensive line that I think Kirby Smart has taken and praised a lot more than the Tennessee offensive line he did a week ago, if Ojulari and Adam Anderson keep playing like they have, I think it's going to go a long way in helping Georgia win on Saturday. This
is a good question from Bank 6. I want to read this, and I want everybody to respond to this. He says, who's under more pressure in the weakness versus weakness side of the ball? And he uses weakness in quotes. Todd Monken or Pete Golding? Mike, who's got more pressure on Saturday, Monken or Golding? It's a good question, actually.
I think Golding does because Todd Monken's playing with a walk-on 4-string. I mean, listen, Stetson Bennett's been playing with house money. Yeah, he's played incredibly well. He's executed incredibly well. He's a great decision maker. As Jeff pointed out, he puts the ball on the money, and his mobility is definitely a weapon and a factor. All that said, if you don't beat Alabama with a former walk-on 4-string quarterback, nobody's gonna blame Todd Monken. The coaches at Tennessee that I've talked to off the record have said that offense is great. Once JT Daniels gets in there, they're not losing again. Tennessee knows that because they went hard after him. So I think it's more on Golding. They have not played well. They have not tackled well. They have not executed well. And I think if Georgia and Stetson Bennett can beat Alabama, this guy might not even get through the season.
Yeah. What do you think, Jeff? More pressure, Monken or Golding?
More pressure, Golding. Definitely. He's got the unit that's beleaguered. I think the only pressure for Georgia in terms of Monken is this is his offense. He's supposed to have veto power or at least carte blanche in terms of picking his guy. You go to Alabama and let's say you lose 21-20 and you do that with perhaps the not most talented quarterback on your team, spinning the ball around.
Well, now, Jeff, just
that's a questionable
one thing. We know that he's cleared, but do we know that he's comfortable enough to play? I don't know that JT Daniels is really at a point where they feel like he can play at 100%, even though he's cleared. So I'd throw that into the equation.
Yeah, my assumption right now is JT Daniels is not. Whatever the definition is, if you're just speaking brass tacks, my assumption is JT Daniels is not ready to play for whatever reason. I'm not even fully sure I understand why, but to use the Rick Pitino line, I don't think JT Daniels is walking in that door. For whatever reason, I just don't think he's there yet.
So here's the thought. Knowing this thing's the way they are, if he was cleared at a certain time, if he was scrimmaging in August, wasn't mobile, wasn't accurate, didn't look like the same RPMs on the ball, didn't look like the same JT Daniels on your film. I don't know how it gets better in 4 weeks, guys. I don't know how the knee and everything else. Remember how Kirby said something about a second surgery in January, how he had to have another surgery and that's kind of pushed things back a little bit. I don't know if JT Daniels is walking through that door. I think what you said there, Brandon, I don't know if he's this guy that Georgia has in the bullpen where, you can call on him like Juan Berenguer or Alejandro Pena, or even let me cover them all. John Rocker back in the day to close out the Georgia season or whatever. I just don't know when he's going to get right if he's not right already, because certainly these coaches want to win. These players want to win. Whatever the reason, Stetson Bennett is showing them that he gives them the best chance to win right now. And for me, unless it ends well, I can't see them breaking out JT Daniels against Alabama, because that's not the guy, brother, that you want to break out your quarterback coming off a gimpy knee against in Tuscaloosa with a lot on the line. You know what we always say? Everybody always used to say, well, if Jake ever lost this game or that game, then that would be the impetus for a change or reason for a change. I think Stetson Bennett has earned this job for the time being. And if he can't get it done in Alabama against Tuscaloosa, then maybe that might open things back up with Kentucky and then a bye week and then Florida to look at.
Mike Shepard says the best Georgia defense ever, should be able to win on Saturday. I will say that my confidence in Georgia's ability to do this has gone up. I'm still not sure that Georgia can actually go out and get it done. My confidence has gone up because of the way this defense has played here thus far. Nitro Z says pressure Mac Jones. We will dominate. Boy, you'd love to see that be true. Tristan West answering the question there to say he thinks it's Todd Monken. Anybody got a final thought before we get ready to get out of here tonight?
I sincerely hope that this game gets played on Saturday, whether or not Nick Saban or not is there. They are still proceeding, that this game will be played, and we'll, I guess, officially find out tomorrow from all the test results. But just, BA mentioned earlier, Georgia-Florida not getting played is a tragedy. For me, this game, I think, not on a similar to BA level scale, but to me, seeing this game played would mean a lot to me personally, and I would like to see that happen.
And I do think – go ahead, Mike.
My final thought is that regardless of what happens Saturday, I think Georgia is going to be able to beat Alabama in December. I think Georgia has more weapons. I like the way this offense is evolving. Regardless of what happens at quarterback, I see a lot of young skill position players getting plugged in. I think the addition of Trey McKitty, I expect Darnell Washington to get better. I expect Jermaine Burton to get better. I think Georgia is a team that will get better as the season progresses. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I don't know if this Alabama offense can get any better than they've already shown you. So that's why I think long run, regardless of what happens Saturday, Georgia is the team that will win the SEC this year.
I think you're right, at least in terms of the trends. The Georgia schedule gets easier. The Alabama schedule gets at least a little bit harder. So from that standpoint alone, the stats should change. Simple yes or no answer. Are you confident the game is played Saturday?
I'm about 85% confident the game will be played without Nick Saban.
Jeff, final thought from you, and then also, are you confident the game is played?
Yeah, I'm confident the game gets played. I hope it gets played. Here's my final thought. If this thing gets postponed, I think it is Lucy with the football and Charlie Brown, because this was supposed to be the measuring stick game for Georgia, this program, and to sit there and say, okay, we'll dial it back up in December and see where things are at. That's going to be very fleeting and frustrating, and a whole year worth of frustration in 2020 for all things, and a lot more important than a football game. Georgia would then have to do what it does against Kentucky, do what it does against Florida, Tennessee. They've beaten Tennessee, but going to go through South Carolina, Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, Missouri. That's going to be a long stretch to where these boys actually feel like they've got the max weight on the bar and they can see how good they are again.
Quick final thought from me. I think the game will be played because I think Alabama wants it to be played. And I think they deserve some credit for, at least the best that I can tell, eager to still compete, even if the head coach is not able to be part of that. I think the Crimson Tide deserves some credit for that. It's a game I believe that Georgia can win. And yet, even if it doesn't, if Georgia can be 4-1 after its first 5 games, as Mike said, still well on track to be where it needs to be come December. I'm not waving the white flag before the game begins. I'm just saying that there will still be plenty of narratives and storylines and plenty of goals to play for, regardless of what happens on Saturday. So maybe a dose of perspective going into the weekend one way or another wouldn't be a bad thing, although it would sure be nice to go in there in Tuscaloosa and contribute to what has been a little bit of an odd season thus far for the Alabama Crimson Tide. All right, plenty more coverage on Dog Nation at the weekend. I'll be in Tuscaloosa this weekend. Really great stuff. Jeff Sintel going to be with us in Dog Nation Daily tomorrow. Triumphant return of our buddy Mike Johnson to give us the perspective of things in Tuscaloosa. We'll welcome him back to the program for the first time in a while. Connor Riley, Mike Griffith all over the site as well at dognation.com. Huge game, big weekend. Can't wait to provide you coverage. Thanks for being here on Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. Have a great week, everybody.